Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from a commenter who requested a video about the Númenorian king Ar-Pharazôn. Now, Ar-Pharazôn was the 25th and final king of Numenor, pretty much responsible for Numenor's downfall. Now, I did a downfall of Numenor video. Some of the information I'm going to talk about was in that video as well, but Ar-Pharazôn is such a notable figure, he deserves his own video as well. There'll be a little overlap because the downfall of Numenor is definitely interwoven with the story of Ar-Pharazôn, but we'll get a little more in depth into who this person was. Okay, so I mentioned he's in the Second Age. Actually, the previous video I did was on the Elven king Gil-galad, who was also a Second Age king, and I mentioned that Gil-galad would probably be a central figure in the Amazon series. As far as Ar-Pharazôn goes, I think eventually he will be in the Amazon series, but I don't think he's like a season 1 guy, okay, because he appears toward the end of the Second Age. And I think that the Amazon series is going to focus, at least in the beginning, on kind of the forging of the rings and such, which is taking place like 1,500 years before Ar-Pharazôn comes into play. So I think eventually he'll be in the Amazon series, but I think he's more of a, maybe even like a season 3 guy or something. But in any case, there you go. Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn. I think I need to set the table a little bit on this, just to talk about the Númenorian kings. As I mentioned, he's the 25th king and the final one. Starting with the 13th king of Númenor, that's Tar-Atonamir, we started seeing a division in Númenorian culture. And the division became known as the Kingsmen versus the Faithful. Okay. And the major point of contention between those two groups was their relationship to the Valar and elves. The Kingsmen thought that Númenorians were equal to the Valar and should not be subject to the rules of the Valar. The Faithful basically treated the Valar as superior beings and so they knew their place. Specifically, this came about with something called the Ban of the Valar, a restriction placed on Númenor, which was, hey, if you're going to sail west, you can only sail as far west as you can still see your own shoreline. So just so you know, if you keep sailing west and you now can't see your own coast, you have broken with the Valar and probably bad things are going to happen to you. And so, I mean, the Númenorians, they're on an island, right? They like sailing. They're, the sea kings. They, sailing is in their blood, and they wanted to sail west. So this restriction really bothered them. They abided by it for thousands of years, but the Kingsman side really resented it and resented the Valar. And so that started, as I mentioned, with this king, King Tar-Atonamir. And gradually over time, now over the course of about 1,000 years, King Atonamir is about 2100-ish in the Second Age. Ar-Pharazôn, or just call him Pharazôn because he's not a king yet, is born around 3100. So about 1,000 years later, this Kingsman versus Faithful thing has been festering, and it's really hitting a boiling point. There are many more Kingsmen at this point than there are Faithful. And what you've got is so there's been a series of kings that have been more Kingsmen. But the 24th king of Numenor is this king named Tar-Palantir. Now, Palantir might sound familiar. The Palantir, or the Palantiri, are the seeing stones that you see. I actually tried to look this up to see if maybe they're named for this king, Tar-Palantir. I didn't see an actual reference to that. Could be a coincidence. Palantir means far-sighted. In the case of the stones, you can understand why that might be, because you can see long distances away with between stones. In the case of Tar-Palantir, the king, he had the gift of foresight. So it kind of makes sense in his respect too. Now, I think you can make an argument that perhaps the Seeing Stones are named for him for a couple of reasons. One, he was a king that was more on the faithful side. So kind of going against the grain of what had been the current thinking of the kings. His mother was of the faithful, and so kind of taught him the ways of saying, look, the Valar and the elves are our friends. They're to be respected, and we should not turn our backs on them. And so one of the things he did was he started tending the white tree, the Nimloth, again. It had been gone into, people, the kings weren't tending the tree anymore. And so it was falling into decay. He started tending the tree, and in a gift of foresight, he prophesied that when the tree died, so would end the line of the Númenorian kings. And that actually came to pass with Ar-Pharazôn. So in any case, he was of the faithful. He respected the Valar. And around this time, because there's such a push for the Kingsman side, the elves, realizing that they may never get to see the Númenorians again because there's going to be this kind of, anti-elf sentiment. Kind of as like a parting gift almost to the faithful, to like what amounts to Amandil, who was Elendil's dad, the Elendil's family. They give them these Seeing Stones as like let us comfort you in this time of sorrow. So you can imagine, perhaps, if that's all happening around the same time, that maybe the Palantir were named in honor of the last king that was actually on the side of the Valar and the elves. Quick note. This is kind of a geeky little thing, but whatever. That's what this is about, right? You can kind of tell, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but you can kind of tell the sentiments and the sympathies of the Númenorian kings by whether there's a T in their title or not. So, for instance, Tar-Palantir. Tar basically means king in Elvish. So he went by Tar-Palantir. Well, the next king is Ar-Pharazôn. Well, Ar removes the T from that front of that name. Ar is the Númenorian way of saying king. And so it's a way of saying, I don't respect Elvish ways. I'm going to call myself by my Númenorian name. And so if you see a king with the T in front of his name, he's probably a faithful. And if you see a king with the R in front of, AR instead of TAR, he's probably a kingsman. As again, it's not a 1-to-1 correlation, but it works out with Palantir and Pharazôn for sure. Okay, so that's what you've got. So during his rule, Palantir is fighting against this kingsman sentiment, and a lot of that kingsman sentiment is being raised by his brother, who is Pharazôn's father. So Pharazôn is all in with his dad, Gimilcad, and the two of them are kingsmen all the way. Boo Valar. So Palantir, does his thing. Upon Palantir's death, he has one child, Miriel, and the scepter of Númenor, and hence rulership, should pass to her. Because, for one thing, Pharazôn's father had passed away earlier. Gimilcad was no more. Well, as a power move, Pharazôn, who's been off in Middle-earth fighting against Sauron, fighting battles, returns to Númenor and forces a marriage with Miriel, with his cousin, essentially, as a power grab to become king. For one thing, Númenorians frown on cousins marrying. We got the Game of Thrones thing with Jon and Dany. Well, in Númenor, yeah, it's not a thing. But Pharazôn doesn't care. He's like, you can say what you want. I'm doing this. I'm forcing this move so that I can become king. And so while it's unseemly and basically is marrying Muriel against her will. Pharazôn goes ahead with it and becomes king. Shortly after he becomes king, he learns that Sauron has taken over so much land in Middle-earth that he's now returning to the lands of the Númenóreans on the coasts, around Umbar, for instance, and is pushing the Númenóreans back to the sea. And in fact, Sauron is calling himself the King of Men. Now, Pharazôn is got an ego on him. He doesn't like Sauron anyway, and he knows Sauron hates the Númenóreans and wants them to perish. But this is kind of the final straw. It's like, I'm the King of Men. How dare you, Sauron, call yourself that? So he builds an army, huge army, sails to Middle-earth to take on Sauron. All right, he arrives at Umbar with his huge navy. And they disembark, and there's no one there. The forces of Sauron, seeing this army approach, flee. They flee before him. So it's like, they want to fight. They can't. There's no one to fight. For 7 days, he travels with his army inland. No fights. Everyone runs in front of them. Sauron, who's been at Barad-dûr, his castle, sees the writings on the wall. This army is too big to beat. My forces have just retreated, and it'd be better in this case to surrender than to fight. And so, there's this huge moment where Pharazôn actually convinces Sauron to surrender. Meets him on this hillside, and they go through the process of surrendering. And boy, all looks great. It's like, wow, that was easy. Didn't have to fight. Mission accomplished. Sauron's defeated. I'm sure there's no follow-up questions. So Sauron, while it seems like a fight probably would have meant him losing, there's also an advantage to him here. So he's like, okay, if I surrender and they take me back to Númenor, I can do some work with my words instead of by force of arms. And that's what ends up happening. To convince Sauron's troops not to fight, he takes Sauron hostage. He's like, if I take you hostage, I'll make sure that whatever forces are still loyal to you don't attack. So Pharazôn brings Sauron to Númenor as his prisoner. Sauron stays there for over 50 years. So he's prisoner-ish for a long time. Within a few years, though, he's already become a very trusted counselor of Ar-Pharazôn. Pharazôn means golden, by the way. So he was the Golden King. And Sauron starts poisoning his mind. There's a little bit of question as to whether or not Sauron had the ring at this point. I mean, he certainly had made it, and he certainly had used it. There's a little discrepancy in the books as to whether he left the ring at Barad-dûr or not. But there is a letter that Tolkien writes in which he confirms that Sauron did, in fact, have the ring with him when he went to Númenor and used it to make his words sound even better. So, they had kept, while the elves knew about the One Ring, they hadn't really shared that information with humanity. And so, unfortunately, let's assume for a second, we'll take Tolkien at his word that Sauron had the ring with him. Pharazôn didn't realize that he's got the most important object. Of course, if he'd have taken it himself, who knows what would have happened then. But horrible things were on their way to happen, so I'm not sure it could have gone any worse. But in any case, Sauron and Ring are corrupting the people of Númenor. So one of the things that Sauron does first is he plays into this Kingsman idea, right? So he's like, hey, you guys are right. The Valar are terrible. They've set up this boogeyman for you of Eru, Ilúvatar, the kind of the one God, as just something to punish you and to keep you down. That it's not really there; it's an illusion. The real power lies with Morgoth. Morgoth is our version of kind of like our Satan, basically from analog to Christianity. Morgoth had been imprisoned in the void back at the end of the First Age, so he'd been out of sight for 3,000 years at this point. But he's not dead; he's just separated from the earth. And so Sauron is his servant, and basically says, "Hey, if you worship Morgoth, he can provide you more power." And in fact, eventually he just says he can help you, conquer death. And I will be the high priest. It's kind of interesting that Sauron is not saying worship me, worship Sauron. He's saying worship Morgoth, and I will be the conduit to help you worship Morgoth. I think maybe one of the reasons for that is just because he's been captured, right? So it's like, why would the Númenóreans worship Sauron? So he's found a way to con them by giving them this other thing out there that's way more powerful. Trust me. So he convinces Pharazôn to build this giant temple to Morgoth, huge dome, and the first thing that they burn is a sacrifice there. They start sacrificing a lot of stuff. But the first thing they burn there is the white tree. Now, Pharazôn he's a little reluctant to burn the tree because he knows the prophecy that Tar-Palantir had mentioned to him, which was, hey, whenever that tree dies, that'll be the end of the line of kings. So he's, Pharazôn is hemming and hawing about actually destroying the tree. And while he's delaying, Isildur, who at this point is a member of the faithful, he's a member of Elendil's family, right? He's the son of Elendil. He sneaks into the main courtyard at the capital and steals a piece of fruit from the white tree. That piece of fruit eventually becomes the first of the white trees that end up in Middle-earth. But because he steals that fruit, and actually got really hurt in the process, the guards of the tree anyway, he survived but took a lot of wounds in the process. So that speeds things along for Pharazôn. He's like, okay, fine, the faithful are trying to save the tree, let's burn it. So they cut the tree down and burn it in the temple in front of what they call the Black Seat. It's where Sauron would sit as the high priest. And so this fire then becomes this sacrificial device. And they start sacrificing animals and people. A lot of the faithful get sacrificed, for instance. That's your main target. Oh, the other side of this equation, let's take their members and throw them onto the fire in honor of Melkor. Another thing they start doing is, in Middle-earth, the Númenóreans who are still there, of which there are many, start hunting non-Númenóreans in Middle-earth and bringing them back for sacrifice. In some cases, I think even sacrificing them in temples that the Númenóreans made in Middle-earth. But it's a horrible time for everyone, and you can imagine that the relationship between the non-Númenóreans in Middle-earth and Númenóreans are now really frayed, right? Because they're like, oh, what? You guys are just hunting us to sacrifice us. So that couldn't have gone over well either. So it's a bad time, and Númenor has lost its way, and Pharazôn is getting older. He's now around, he's getting close to 200 years old, and he wants basically everlasting life. And so Sauron convinces him, if you sail to Aman and take on the Valar, that's where you will acquire the power to have, power over death. So Pharazôn starts building what they call the Great Armament. It's basically the largest navy ever created. It's huge, and it takes him years to do it. It takes him 9 years to build this armament up. And so, while he's in the middle of working on this, the faithful, see bad times are coming. And so Elendil's father, Amandil, decides he's going to sail west and try to warn the Valar about what's coming. Basically make a plea. He knows that by doing that he's going to break the bane of the Valar, but he's hoping he's doing it for the right reasons. He has precedents. There was Yarindil the mariner, who was a mortal that sailed west and didn't pay the price for that because he was doing it for noble reasons. So I think that's what Amandil's hoping for, is that his reasons are noble enough that perhaps he will be welcomed by the Valar when he goes. He feels like he has to make that attempt. So he sails away and is never seen again. We can assume he was not met with, not welcomed. So that leaves Elendil as the kind of the patriarch of the leader of the faithful. And it's during the downfall of Númenor that he takes some ships and he takes the Seeing Stones and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, and they sail to Middle-earth. I should mention that Amandil and Pharazôn actually were childhood friends. They grew up, I don't say childhood, but as young adults, they were actually friends, even though they were on opposite sides of this kind of, I would say political, but almost religious fence. So I think that's also probably why Amandil and his family were not sacrificed. I think because they had this relationship with Pharazôn, and so even though at one point Pharazôn kicks Amandil off the council, he doesn't then go, and by the way, I'll throw you on a spit. So anyway, bad times are coming. The armament is prepared, and there starts becoming portents, clouds in the shape of eagles and storms. And at one point, there's a big lightning storm that starts striking the temple, this temple to Morgoth. And Sauron gets on top of the temple and is struck by lightning. Survives. And, the kingsmen that see this act actually see him as a god, because he survived this lightning storm and no one else would. And so it actually increases Sauron's, cachet as this high priest with the kingsmen. So storms don't really do their job, right? And also, there's a bit where Pharazôn basically says, oh, they're striking the first blow? Well, we're going to strike the last blow. So it kind of hardens their hearts against the Valar. Like, see, they are bad. And so they sail off. This is 3319. So it's near the end of the Second Age, but not it doesn't mark the end of the Second Age. So 3319, the huge, great armament sails off, and after a while, they lose sight of that coastline. They arrive in great numbers. They disembark. The army marches to Tirion. At this point, so the Valar have sworn not to interfere with humanity. They can't, for instance, Manve can't go up and smack down the humans. So they make an appeal to Iluvatar, and Iluvatar does the dirty work for the Valar. Basically, giant cataclysm occurs. An abyss opens up under all the ships. They disappear. The mountains collapse on top of Pharazôn's army. And back in Númenor, where Sauron is sitting, he's sitting in the black seat in that temple, and he's apparently laughing in the moment, thinking at the thought of how he's totally screwed over the Númenorians. And in that moment, he feels something rocking, and then the ground opens up and the temple is destroyed, and his physical form is destroyed. And his spirit returns to Middle-earth, back to Barad-dûr, and with the power of the ring, he, basically reconstitutes himself. But he is no longer ever able to take on a pleasing form. So he can't take on the fair con artist form. He has to be the grim, demonic-looking form that we see in the Battle of the Last Alliance, which will happen, some years later. So Númenor, the island, is gone, just destroyed. It disappears under the waves. And there's a legend of the fate of Ar-Pharazôn. So he and his men, mountain fell on him. You'd think dead. But there is a part, as I mentioned, the legend, poetically speaking, that they are merely trapped under the land, and that they are in the caverns of the forgotten. And at some point, when the battle of Dagor-Dagorath, kind of Tolkien's version of Ragnarok, Tolkien wrote about this and then kind of dismissed it and didn't include it in the final version of his Middle-earth, but for a long time it was a part of his mythology, this Dagor-Dagorath. At the time of Dagor-Dagorath, supposedly, Melkor, Morgoth, will escape from the void, and there will be a series of heroes are going to reemerge to fight either for or against Morgoth. I believe it's Turin in the very end. The hero will end up killing Morgoth. But among those forces that will be reborn would be Ar-Pharazôn and his mighty army would emerge from the mountains and fight. Now, which side they fight on is actually unmentioned. I'd argue they'd fight for Morgoth, right? I mean, did they learn anything during their time trapped? I don't think they would have learned. So I think they were certainly on the side of Morgoth when they were killed. I think they would probably fight on the wrong side in that eventual giant battle of battles, Dagor-Dagorath. Another little part of that destruction of Númenor, part of that tale, is that Miriel, I mentioned Miriel, she was the daughter of Tar-Palantir, who Pharazôn kind of forced to marry in order to gain the throne. So she remained his wife. They didn't have kids. At the time of the destruction of Númenor, she tries to climb the sacred mountain. It's Meneltarma. Meneltarma is kind of right in the middle of Númenor. It's a big volcano, basically. It had been dormant for a long time. Wasn't dormant when the downfall happened, but in any case, it was a sacred mountain, and there were a lot of ceremonies to the Valar that would occur at the top of that mountain. It had a flat surface at the top. Obviously, since it was connected with the Valar and there was a sacred rite of climbing this mountain, at one point, Ar-Pharazôn forbids anyone from climbing the mountain. It becomes an act, the treason, essentially. So his wife, Miriel, at the time when everything bad's happening, she makes that ascent. She's trying to climb the mountain. I think for two reasons. One, it's probably because it's the highest point on the island, and that's probably where you want to go if the island is sinking. But also because she's going to try to get to that plateau to make a plea to the Valar, right? Maybe make a prayer, and who knows, desperate people do desperate things. However, everything sinks, including the summit of Meneltarma, and she drowns. So everyone is lost except for this small group of the faithful that sail off to Middle-earth. And we know from there, obviously Elendil ends up making an alliance with Gil-galad, King Gil-galad, the Elven King, who I mentioned in my last video. They start the War of Last Alliance, take on Sauron, cut the ring off his finger. Isildur takes the ring. You know the rest. But so that's the group that leaves Númenor there. Interestingly, so Ar-Pharazôn basically is a villain, right? I mean, he was the most powerful Númenorian king. He's the last one. Led them down a horrible path of human sacrifice, taking on the gods. But even so, many years after his death, when Elendil and the company had gone to Middle-earth, they set up a monument to him called the White Pillar on the highest point near the harbor of Umbar, as a testament to that time when Pharazôn came to Middle-earth and conquered Sauron. So the White Pillar is what it sounds like. It's a giant white pillar with a crystal on top. The crystal would absorb the rays of the sun and the moon, and it would shine. So it was basically a lighthouse. And this lighthouse would shine out from the top hill of Umbar, and all around would know that it was there, because that was the time when Númenorians humbled Sauron, captured him. Well, years later, when servants of Sauron took that land again from the Númenorians, they tore down the White Pillar because, it was an affront to their master Sauron, and so the White Pillar was destroyed. But I think it was interesting how Elendil, even though they were like, yeah, this guy was horrible, they still respected that moment when he came to Middle-earth for whatever reasons, if they were ego-driven, and conquered Sauron and put him in his place. Ar-Pharazôn's personal ship, when he created the Great Armament, was named Al-Corundus, which means Castle of the Sea. And it was this monstrous ship. It was black and gold. Obviously, since his name means golden, he used gold in his color schemes. But it was this just incredibly impressive ship. It was obviously taken out with the rest of the boats during the Cataclysm. And Eru also prevented any ship from ever sailing to Aman again, because what he did is he reshaped the world. He made the world round instead of flat. And so he basically put Aman out here, and Valinor out here, and the rest of the earth is over here. And so you would never be able to sail there unless you knew kind of the secret route. So when they're sailing west in the Lord of the Rings, they're not just on water. They're going to be basically flying through space to get to heaven, essentially. But that was the moment when heaven, if you want to call it that, was separated from earth. You could not get there by normal means anymore. Thanks, Númenorians. Anyway. Some people ask, what were the Nazgûl doing during this time when, Sauron is being held hostage / being the high priest in Númenor for 50 plus years? The Nazgûl had already been, taken in, and they were back on Middle-earth. 3 of the Nazgûl were Númenorians, including the Witch King of Angmar. He was probably a higher up from the Umbar region of Middle-earth. But the Nazgûl never came over to Númenor during the time that Sauron was there. They basically did Sauron's bidding in Middle-earth in his stead while Sauron hung out in Númenor. So yeah, Pharazôn's story is a tragedy. He was somebody that had a lot of ability, created this massive army, perhaps the most massive army in Tolkien's history, and just horrible pride and a fear of death drove him to make some really, really bad decisions. So a lot of the events that happened in Lord of the Rings can be traced back to the decisions made by Ar-Pharazôn when he captured Sauron on the field of battle, and instead of dealing with him, listened to him, and just made some horrible choices that resulted in thousands of years of troubles and an entire island sinking under the sea. So, such is the fate of Ar-Pharazôn. Thanks a lot, everybody. If you've got a video you'd like me to do about a topic of your choice, just put it in the comments. Be happy to do such a video. I've got a few of them in the works for some other commenters. Don't worry, I'm getting to your video. But thanks so much, everybody. I love the comments. I read all of them, and I try to respond to all of them as well. Thanks again, and talk to you next time. Bye.